How about HIV? When the AIDS virus really started impacting our population and decreasing the immunity, we saw a spike. People who were full-blown AIDS patients do not have the ability to fight influenza-like viruses and the secondary bacterial infections that they get. Also, in the 1980s, we were just starting to see, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, we were just starting to see the beginning of antibiotic resistance. All of these viruses and bacterial were really starting to morph and resist what we had able to throw at them. All of this, because we're still worrying about the antibiotic resistance, while we're talking about viruses, when we talk about pneumonia, we're talking about bacteria, has increased the risk for people and increased the risk of death. That worries us. Let's take a few minutes to talk about the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic. An epidemic can be described as a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community at a particular time. Or it can be described as the outbreak of a disease that affects a greater number of people than is usual for that locality, or that spreads to regions where it's not ordinarily seen. Got that? Well, I'm not so sure I do either, so let me try again. An epidemic is when more people get a specific disease in a particular area than what we'd normally expect to see. Now, it doesn't have anything necessarily to do with how bad that disease is. For example, we could be talking about dental decay in the town of Hanover. Well, that might be considered an epidemic, not one that we're probably going to worry about so much. But you get the picture. Let's say in the town of Concord, we had 6 cases of salmonella. That could be an epidemic. We don't normally see salmonella in Concord, and we certainly don't normally see 6 cases. Let's bring that out to the extreme of the epidemic before it morphs into pandemic. Let's say in Conway, there's 100 cases of Ebola. This could be very concerning because as that Ebola spreads wildly, it's going to go from an endemic to a pandemic. So could be the end of the world. Could also mean we get some good prices at the malls there in Conway, but you get the picture. An epidemic, local area, increase in number, disease we don't usually see. So from epidemic, we go to pandemic. Pandemic means that this one disease is occurring simultaneously throughout an entire country or in many areas of the world. As you can see, the little pockets here. This one looks pretty scary as far as I can see. It looks like just about everywhere in the world has been affected. How does this happen? Well, just think of how our population is and the mobility that we have nowadays. So it's very easy to conceive. Someone travels to Southeast Asia, gets ill, doesn't know they're ill yet, gets on the plane to come back home, or let's say to Japan, China, that's a long flight home. And so by the time they get home, they're ill. But while they were on the plane, they were coughing a little bit, they were sneezing, spreading this bacteria throughout the plane. Go home, the person's sick, but every single person that was on that 747 with them is now carrying that same viral load. Here it goes. People go from Germany to London to South America. We like to travel. It's very easy for this to happen. Very, very easy to reach a pandemic level. When the World Health Organization this year declared a pandemic for H1N1, they weren't necessarily reflecting how serious or how life-threatening H1N1 could be, but they were reflecting upon the fact that there was quite a bump up, areas that we didn't see, and it was really in 4 or 5 different countries showing up. Hence a pandemic. As I said earlier, the purposes for this training, we're going to be concentrating on the diseases of influenza and pneumococcal pneumonia. Influenza, we know we call it the flu. It's a viral infection. It infects the nose, the throat, the lungs mostly. It's a serious disease. Most people are sick for a couple of weeks, but then after that, not so much. But think back to those vulnerable populations that we talked about. So in an average year, just in the United States alone, the flu can cause as much as 36,000 deaths, 200,000 hospitalizations. And just think of how many more times than that there's visits to your local emergency department or emergent visits to the medical profession. The flu season generally runs from November to April. Flu viruses, for some reason, seem to prefer colder months. We may see that changing, again, relating to how mobile our population is and how people congregate in the summer months. But traditionally still, November through April is considered our flu season. Annual flu vaccine, we generally give that in October because it takes about 2 weeks after the vaccine is given for our bodies to build up the immunity. So if we give the flu vaccine in October, we're primed, ready for the November bump up in flu. The other thing we want to talk about is the fact that influenza is actually carried on the RNA strands. Now, if you can think back to when you were in medic school, at least that's what Clay tells me, is that in medic school you guys learned about genetics in DNA and RNA. So DNA is very stable for the most part. And DNA recognizes when a mistake has been made, and DNA will correct a mistake. DNA does not like to have mistakes in their transcription, doesn't like to have mutations. RNA, on the other hand, its job is to be very adaptable. Very good for RNA, not so good for us as we try to develop vaccines to help take care of flu. So that's going to play a part in how effective our vaccines are. But the point is, paramedicine is changing, and so our knowledge base is really expanding.